Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is Thomas Jefferson, Part 1. Now, you might say to me, "Oh, Pete, you're wearing a Cleveland Browns t-shirt, giving a talk on Thomas Jefferson. How some respect." Well, I'm glad you raised that question, because actually, Thomas Jefferson was against fancy clothes, formal clothes. He believed they supported the ideas of aristocracy and nobility and gentility and monarchy, and an idea that a person was superior based on the family he was born in or the amount of money that he had. And Jefferson believed what was important in life was character, good character, and knowledge, learning, and ability and talents. And so he was very much against fancy clothes, actually. In fact, at one point he wore slippers to meet the British ambassador as president, because he felt that some people thought, "Oh, look at me, look at my clothes." People thought I'm superior. Look how, and he didn't believe an individual should be respected based on the family they were born into or the amount of money that they had. So I think Thomas Jefferson would approve of my attire. Okay, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States of America. We finished with George Washington and John Adams, and now we'll talk about this amazing man, Thomas Jefferson, one of the most incredible people in history, and certainly in American history. His profile is on the nickel coin, and on the other side of the coin is the image of his famous home, Monticello. And Monticello is the wonderful home that he built near Charlottesville, Virginia, and it's similar, kind of similar to Mount Vernon, one of these very beloved homes of a former president. Mount Vernon for Washington, Monticello, built on this on a mountain near Charlottesville, Virginia. Of course, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial is a wonderful place to visit in Washington, D.C., and built in his memory. His face is also carved into stone at Mount Rushmore, South Dakota, along with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. Thomas Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence. That was one of his claims to fame, which was released to the public on July 4th, 1776, this is the birth of our country. And they've had the famous words, "All men are created equal." And this was one of the great things of Jefferson's life, as he promoted the equality of opportunity and equality before the law. All men are created equal. And he played a major role in the United States becoming a land of opportunity, where an individual, didn't matter his family background or the country of origin, you could succeed in America based on hard work and perseverance and good character and talent and education. One of the maybe the best thing, one of the best things Jefferson did is he helped the United States become a land of religious freedom. And if you look at our history of the United States, people have come from different religions and succeeded in America and contributed. Protestant Christians, Catholic Christians, so many Jewish immigrants who've contributed their tremendous talents in our country. And in the 20th century, in recent times, Buddhist immigrants, Hindu immigrants, Muslim immigrants, and so forth. So in other countries of the world, up till now, there's religious oppression. If you're in a certain religion, a government will favor a certain religion and oppress others. This is still true in many countries. And in Europe, there'd been all this terrible fighting between Catholics and Protestants. And we haven't wasted time with that in the United States. What a waste of time when religious people fight over religion. And the persecution of Jewish people in Europe, terrible. And this is in America. People around the world came to believe and to know that if they came to the United States, regardless of their religion, they could succeed, and they would be respected. They could have religious freedom. They could pursue the religion that they were interested in, and without harassment, without facing problems with the government. And Thomas Jefferson was really a leader in making that happen, because during the colonial era, it wasn't true. In the English colonies, the Anglican Church was dominant and favored by the government, and other religions were were persecuted in the 13 North American English colonies. Thomas Jefferson is the founder of the University of Virginia. Amazing accomplishment. The thing that I love about Thomas Jefferson is that he believed in learning. He believed in education. He was a very curious man, and he became very knowledgeable in many fields. He believed in education, and he believed that education should be for all. And of course, during his time, very few people could go to school, but he promoted the idea that everyone should be able to go to school, and that has become true. That's how it is now. Public schools are for everyone. And so you could call Thomas Jefferson a Renaissance man. He was into so many different things, into history, literature, science. He was big into science. He loved nature, he loved architecture, so many different fields, poetry. Wonderful, very well-rounded man, like the model of the ancient Greeks. And he was into gardening and being the great outdoors, riding his horse. Although, to be more accurate, you could call him the man of the Enlightenment, because that was the era he lived, the Enlightenment, which had started in Europe in the 1700s and changed the world when people really started to think more and learn more. And Jefferson was a part of that, which challenged traditional ideas of aristocracy and monarchy and so forth. Jefferson is also the founder of the Democratic Party, which is one of the two major parties today. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13th, 1743, at the Shadwell Plantation on the Rivanna River in Albemarle County, Virginia. He was the third of 10 children and the oldest son. His mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, came from a very wealthy, powerful family in Virginia. And his father was Peter Jefferson, who was a self-made man. His father was an amazing person. He was really something. He was a very big guy. He was maybe 6'4", very big and tall and very, very strong physically. He had a number of occupations. He was a surveyor in Virginia. That was an important work that needed to be done. So this was something that George Washington was involved in. He was in the militia, which is the colonial military fighting Indians in the West. He was a justice of the peace. He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, so he's into politics, the legislative body. He had a strong mind and a strong body, and Thomas Jefferson had a wonderful relationship with his father. He had a wonderful father, Peter Jefferson, who was very, very loving and really promoted knowledge. He himself was into knowledge, very knowledgeable fellow, really loved to learn, read books, but he was also very physically, he was a very athletic, big, strong guy, and he worked very, very hard. In fact, he really worked too hard. He was a very, very active fellow. Now, he had a good friend who died when Thomas was 2, and he decided to move his family into that home to help raise the children and to help keep things going for that family. And that was so that the family moved to Goochland County, and they stayed there for 7 years. This was a little bit awkward for Thomas because he grew up with these other children who, it was 2 families in one home. But his father did that because he had a sense of duty to his friend, and they needed help. They needed him to be there, to run their plantation, to run their farm, and to help raise these children who were growing up. They stayed there for 7 years. It was called Tuckahoe in Goochland County. And then in 1752, they moved back to Shadwell, their home. They call these homes that had names. Shadwell. Thomas was 9. However, Thomas stayed in Goochland County because he was tutored by this Reverend William Douglas. The father was very busy, and there really were no schools, so you had to be tutored if you wanted an education back then. At least, and so this fellow, William Douglas, taught Thomas Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, and Italian, among other things. So he was 9 years old. He was away from home, although he would come home to visit, and he really became a fine scholar. When he was 14, he moved back home to Shadwell in Albemarle County in April. And he had seen his father over the years, because his father was very busy. Was out, in his work as a surveyor and at the the House of Burgesses. But when they were together, they had a really good time together. And in August, his father died. In fact, so this was very tough. Thomas Jefferson lost his father at age 14, kind of like George Washington, except he was the oldest son, and there was money for his education. It was very, very tough losing his father because he had an amazing father, and actually his father, I think, worked himself to death, which is very, very possible if it's easy to do too much. And even though he was a big, strong guy, he must have done too much, and he died. And so this was the first of many tragedies in the life of Thomas Jefferson, and very, very hard losing his father. He was grief-struck because he was close to his father, had a very loving relationship. His father was a very good man, very good guy, and very positive influence on his son, very healthy guy, and into so many things. And Thomas really missed him, but over the years, he met other men who became father figures to him. Now, after his father's death, he was estranged from his mother. They saw each other, but he wasn't close to her. They didn't get along. She came from this very wealthy family, and Thomas would get fed up with all the society things, the parties, the social gatherings, which he thought were a waste of time, which his mother pressured him to attend because that was part of the society. And he really hated that, and that was partly why he ended up being against these ideas of superiority based on wealth or based on family. So this was tough. The following year, he became a student of Reverend James Morey in Fredericksville, in also Albemarle County, for 2 years. And this James Morey became a father figure to him, and was a very positive influence. He was very grateful to Reverend James Morey, and Thomas lived with him for 2 years, studying long hours. He really became, Thomas Jefferson really loved learning, and it was during this time he got into learning. In 1760, Thomas entered and became a student at the College of William and Mary, which is where the people would put their sons from the top families. And there was only one street, the Duke of Gloucester Street, and the Raleigh Tavern is where there were many political discussions. Now this is, of course, Williamsburg was the capital of Virginia. So there was all this, so when Thomas entered college, there was all this, there were a lot of political things going on. And again, he was dedicated to learning, loved learning. He loved his time at the College of William and Mary, and he was also, and this was the beginning of the American Revolution, the conflict with Great Britain. And so Thomas, as a college student, was right there, and exposed to what was going on. And he became friends with Francis Fauquier, who was the governor of Virginia. Even though, eventually Jefferson was a major player in the American Revolution, but this British governor, who was he really loved. They had a really good time together, and they would get together and have very intellectual discussions. And Fauquier was a protege of Sir Isaac Newton, very talented fellow. Jefferson finished college in 2 years and graduated in 1762 from the College of William and Mary. And then he became a law student, decided to become a lawyer. And back then, if you wanted to be a lawyer, you would work for a lawyer as a clerk, and you'd have access to his books, which you would spend part of your time reading. And he was a law student of George Wythe, who was also another father figure. Jefferson, he had a very positive influence on Jefferson. Good man. And Jefferson spent 5 years studying to be a lawyer. Kind of took his time, because at the same time he was studying law, he was studying languages, physics, agriculture, mathematics, philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, zoology, botany, religion, politics, history, and literature. So there are so many things to learn, and Jefferson wanted to learn it all. It kind of reminded me of Thomas Wolfe. Anyway, Jefferson was a really interesting. I admire that so much. It's very inspiring, this interest in learning, especially so many different fields. Jefferson had this to say about George Wythe, this lawyer who was his helped him become a lawyer. Quote, No man ever left behind him a character more venerated than George Wythe. His virtue was of the highest tint, his integrity inflexible, and his justice exact. Of warm patriotism, and devoted as he was to liberty and the natural and equal rights of man, he might truly be called the Cato of his country. Cato is this nice reference to ancient Rome, this fellow who had rebelled against Julius Caesar. And I know he was a big hero back then in that era. I know George Washington also admired Cato. In 1765, Jefferson was a law student, and he would attend these House of Burgesses meetings from time to time, when they were in session. And then Patrick Henry, Patrick Henry was a friend of his, a little bit older, and then there was this, the Stamp Act had been passed. So this was very controversial British act, which was very problematic, and in Boston, a lot of rebellion in Boston against it, and John Adams was affected by it. And then Patrick Henry gave this speech. He was in the House of Burgesses. He'd been elected, and Patrick Henry, was giving a speech in which he was questioning the right of Great Britain to tax the colonies. And this was very controversial. And then there's some of the individuals were crying, treason, treason. Treason, which is, basically a rebellion against your country, which is a criminal act. And Patrick Henry was able to, he handled this well. He said, "If this be treason, make the most of it." So that's a very famous speech. part of the events which led to the American Revolution. And Jefferson was very impressed by the speech, and he said, quote, "He appeared to speak as Homer wrote." Of course, Homer, the great ancient Greek author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so this you could say this day, May 29th, 1765, inspired Thomas Jefferson to go into politics and to lead a life of patriotic service. He later said it was the most important day of his life. And later, he and Patrick Henry had severe conflict. But on this day, Patrick Henry really inspired Jefferson to get involved in politics and what was going on with the problems with Great Britain. By 1767, Jefferson had passed the bar and was now working as a lawyer. He spent the next 7 years as a lawyer working, and he did well. He had 1,000 cases, and he traveled around the state. Most of his cases involved land, disputes over land. There was a lot of speculation. A lot of people were getting land, and they had to. They were acquiring land, and they were expected to work the land, to turn it into farmland. And if they didn't, they could forfeit the land. So there were a lot of issues over. Most of his cases had to do with land, and he did well. Actually, he had a very successful legal career. And he wrote this about his legal career. Quote, "I was bred to the law, and that gave me a view of the dark side of humanity. Then I read poetry to qualify it with a gaze upon its bright side." So even though he had to make a living, of course he had a farm. They had farm income, but he also needed to do something besides that. And he was interested in a legal career, which actually came in handy in his political career. 2 years later, he was elected to the House of Burgesses himself. And so he was into politics. He was still practicing law. So he was in the legislative body for Virginia. And George Washington and Patrick Henry were also in the House of Burgesses. And he remained in that body for the next 10 years. So he was getting into politics. He had the farm at home at Shadwell, and he had his legal career. In 1770, the family home burned to the ground, Shadwell. This was a disaster. There was a fire, and almost all of his books were destroyed. Only a few were saved. But his violin was saved. Jefferson played the violin. He loved playing the violin. He loved music, so they were able to save his violin and a few books. But this was pretty hard. This was the family home that his father had built, and it was so hard losing that because had a lot of memories with his father, the family home at Shadwell. So this was tough. Another tough thing that happened to him. After that, he started planning Monticello, his own which was in a different location on a mountaintop. Then he developed a love of architecture. So once Shadwell burned, he didn't rebuild it. Or at least not that did not become his home. He built his own home, Monticello, which became so famous. And actually, that's where he had gone with a very good friend growing up, Dabney Carr. He would go to this hill, and his Jefferson, his oldest daughter, actually the only child of his to survive into middle age and old age. Her name was Patsy, and she wrote this about Monticello years later, quote, "I have heard my father say that when he was quite a boy, the top of this mountain was his favorite retreat. Here he would bring his books to study. Here he would pass his holiday and leisure hours. He never wearied of gazing on the sublime and beautiful scenery that spread around, bounded only by the horizon or the far-off mountains, and the indescribable delight he here enjoyed so attached him to the spot that he determined when he arrived at manhood he would here build his family mansion." Well, and he did, and of course it has a very nice view. It's not far from Charlottesville, Virginia. In fact, you can see from Monticello. You can see the cupola, or the main building at the University of Virginia. So that same year, in 1770, Jefferson wrote, quoting Horace, who was a famous guy from ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, quote, "Happy the man who, far from business cares, works his ancestral acres with his steers, from all money lending free. He avoids the forum and proud thresholds of more powerful citizens." Yeah, so Jefferson, this Monticello became this very wonderful place for him, this retreat. He would often go back. Kind of reminds me of Scarlett O'Hara and Gone with the Wind, and of course Washington would go home to. Scarlett would go home to Tara. Always want to go home to Tara. Washington would want to go home to Mount Vernon, and Adams would want to go home to Peacefield or Monticello. And Jefferson loved going home and to Monticello. In 1771, Jefferson discovered, or for the first time saw, what's called the Natural Bridge in Virginia. Amazing thing. It's this amazing sight, and he purchased the bridge and the 755 acres of land which surround it. In 1772, Jefferson married a woman, a young widow named Martha Wales Skelton, and he got married. And she was also loved books and music. They both were they had a lot in common. They loved reading. They loved learning. She was an intellectual. They made music together. He'd play the violin and she'd play the piano. And so his wife, her real name was Martha, but they called her Patty. So they had a good marriage. Although she had health problems, she was sick a lot. She had depression, and he was always worried about her. Because he would have to go away. He'd have to leave her at Monticello, and she really missed him. So when they were together, they had real good times because she was real smart, and that was important to him. He was an intellectual. He liked to talk about learned things. So she loved to learn herself. She loved music, so they had a lot in common. And she was called a constant reader, loved reading. That same year, Jefferson wrote a book called A Summary of the Rights of British America. And this was the beginning of his fame. He became famous for his writing. And because we were headed toward the Revolution. As I said, he and Patrick Henry were friends, but then they spent a lot of time together. And Patrick Henry was an interesting guy. He was a very good speaker, but he was pretty lazy. He didn't read much. He just relied on his force of personality and his fact that he could speak very well. In that same year, 1772, Jefferson wrote about Patrick Henry, quote, "Patrick Henry could not draw up a bill or brief on the most simple subject which would bear legal criticism, which looks to correctness of style and ideas, for indeed there was no accuracy of ideas in his head. His imagination was copious, poetical, sublime, but vague. He said the strongest things in the finest language, without logic, without arrangement. So that was an interesting arrangement. Yeah, that book, Jefferson's book, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, made him famous. Now that year, 1774, Jefferson retired from he retired from legal practice. His legal career came to an end, and he devoted himself to politics and running his family farm at Monticello. So that was the end. He really got tired of his work, and besides, the revolution was imminent. So there was a lot going on politically. He was very busy with politics in the House of Burgesses, with writing, and with his home, and making a living as a farmer. So here's a quote from that book, from his book, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. Quote, "That these are our grievances, which we have laid before His Majesty, with that freedom of language and sentiment which becomes a free people, claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature, and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. Kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. Open your breast, sire." Now he's addressing the King of Great Britain. "Open your breast, sire, to liberal and expanded thought. Let not the name of George III be a blot in the page of history." Now that great line is that kings are the servants of the people, which really contradicted the traditional ideas. If you're a king, you do whatever you want. You enjoy yourself. You enjoy power, and you enjoy luxury, because you have that divine right, that according to their beliefs. 1775, actually the American Revolution started. The fighting started at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and Jefferson was 32 years old, and he was elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So for the first time, he traveled outside of Virginia to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had a daughter, Jane, who died in September. She was only a year and a half. And actually, earlier that year, his mother died in March, suddenly. And it was very sad. They had been estranged. They did not have a good relationship. And it was it's hard when somebody dies and you haven't reconciled. And Jefferson became very sick. He was sick he had severe headaches for 5 weeks. So his daughter, they had these two deaths in 1775, and he had a private graveyard at Monticello. His good friend Dabney Carr had died years before and was buried there. And Jefferson actually took in the widow, which was his sister, and the children. He decided to raise those two children to support them, because this very, very good friend Dabney Carr had died. Dabney's buried there. And he had a sister. Jefferson also had a sister named Jane, who was mentally retarded, who had wandered off one day and died. And it's not clear how, whether it was the elements, she was out in the cold, but she's also buried there. He was taking care of her, and then of course his mother, and now this daughter, another daughter named Jane. They're all buried at Monticello. As I said, after his mother died, he had a 5 weeks of severe headaches, and this left him bedridden and unable to do anything. He was incapacitated. And this was something that happened every 6 to 8 years. Jefferson would have these, when he was under great stress, he would have these horrific headaches and become incapacitated for about a month. He couldn't do anything. He'd just have to lay in bed in pain. And I think, my opinion is that he was a worker. He drove himself to learn and work and do stuff, and I guess it would wear him out from time to time. And he did face a lot of stress in his life. So this is what happened with him. We're out of time. We're gonna conclude this session, and so I'll quote William Shakespeare. Good night, parting is such sweet sorrow, that I shall say good night till it be morrow. Bye, see you next time.